Hello guys, how to structure Laravel projects. This is by far the #1 question I get over the years, or more precisely, where to move the logic from the controller. Should it be action, service, trait, or something else? And in this video, I will show you the results of an interesting experiment we made with the team. So here you can see Laravel Controller method code, store, and the question is, how would you refactor that? And we tried to do that. First I attempted it, then I asked two of my teammates, Nereus and Modestas, but then also we decided to ask AI assistants, 4 of them, different assistants. So you have 7 versions of the same refactoring independently with a general question, how you would refactor this code. And the idea came from a tweet by Davor here, who just openly asked, how would you refactor this Laravel code? And this is exactly the prompt that we made for AI Assistant without giving more context. How would they refactor that? And I will also link that tweet in the description below so you can see the replies by people, quite a few of them, pretty interesting and different approaches. But in this course, we will go step by step. So we recreated that project ourselves, the same controller method with the logic that was required, like models and some more configuration. So we will go step by step. Would you refactor this line of code, authorization logic, then validation logic, then separate extra validation logic, and so on. The thing here is that controller method is obviously too long and responsible for too many things at once. And another separate, obvious, interesting question, how did AI assistants do? And kind of a teaser, they all did pretty well. So I will link the repository in the description below so you may take a look at all of them, but we divided all their PRs, pull requests, into 2 parts. The main conversation was the text part, so what did they actually do, refactor, key changes explained, so you may read the why from them, and then the files change contain the actual logic, what was refactored. So prepare yourself some warm drink and let's go see the refactoring process by 7 different participants of this experiment. So first we will talk about validation. Should it be refactored? And validation comes in 2 steps. Validation of roles and permissions, which is basically authorization, and then validation of request. So first we'll talk about authorization. Should that line of code be somehow changed? And first let's see how we suggested to do this, our team, 3 different people. So this is one version from one of my teammates, the pull request, and you will basically see the pull request step by step, but I will focus on different lines of code. So instead of this line, abort unless is deleted in favor of form request, which has authorize method, which is basically just removing this line and moving it to form request class. This is another version by myself. I did basically the same thing, remove that line from controller and then form request, move that here, just used auth user instead of this user. And then the third version by another teammate, which is also removing that line in favor of form request, authorize, identical. So basically we all 3 agreed separately without talking to each other that we should move the check of authorization to form request. Now, what does AI think about it? First, ChatGPT. It also moved that from store method, but not into a separate class, but into a separate method, authorize reservation from the same controller. So if we scroll down, we see authorize reservation, which is the same thing, abort unless with 403. In my opinion, it's a bit pointless because you're moving things in the same controller and not using really the framework features like form request class. Then we have Claude AI, which did the same removal of that line in the controller in favor of another line called this authorize make reservation. And then we have auth service provider with gate make reservation. And here we have user token can inside. A few things here, Claude AI did it in a way how Laravel 10 was structured. So in Laravel 11, there's no auth service provider by default. You can still create it, but it's not by default. And also in the controller, this authorize is not present anymore in Laravel 11. You can still enable that by putting this use authorize as requests. We did that manually. Claude didn't add that. So basically, Claude assumed that we're using not the latest Laravel version, but it's maybe fine because we didn't really specify which version we are on. So the idea behind that refactoring is to use gates, so the same gate name would be potentially reused elsewhere. It looks like much more code in the beginning, but it may be reusable in the future. Then we have GitHub Copilot, and instead of abort unless, we didn't see any changes. So according to GitHub Copilot, this line is fine and we shouldn't change anything, which is also okay. If you prefer to read that validation directly in the controller, this may be fine. And finally, we have CodeRabbit, and we see this. In the store, that line is deleted in favor of this authorize again. And again, CodeRabbit forgot this, so we added that manually. So again, it assumes Laravel 10 probably. And then that create of that reservation class is resolved in policy. So we have a new reservation policy class with create method, and again, token can. It's similar to gate, just structuring gates into policies. In this case, for now, it's just one gate, one method, but with the idea that we will have more methods like edit reservation, update reservation, delete reservation, and others. So see how many different options we have just for one small line of code, how to refactor that. This is one of the proof that when I'm getting a question how to structure Laravel projects, the answer is however you want. Basically, all those answers are valid, depends on your preferences. The next step of that controller method is validation of request data, but it also comes in two kind of parts or waves. First, we request the data and validate it just from the input, but then we also need to validate a few things about the office that is passed, office ID. We get it from the database and check a few things about it. If the office does not belong to the same user, or if it's not hidden or unapproved. So how did the different participants of that experiment tackle those two steps? First, the data request validation. This is pretty simple. The first version from one of my teammates is just removing those lines of code in favor of form request with this. Nothing really fancy except for custom validation rule, and we will get to that in a minute. But the general request data validation is just moving that to form request. Same thing I did in my attempt is just form request, removing this, and then form request contains the same lines of code. And another teammate, again request validate removed, we go to form request and we see the same thing. So nothing really fancy here. Did the AI assistant do the same? ChatGPT, it didn't create the form request as we already saw. It has validate reservation method, which calls request validate. So it's basically the same thing, moving parts of code in different methods of the same controller. Claude AI removing those lines in favor of form request, and those form request rules are here. Identical how we did with our teammates. GitHub Copilot, we have this validate request, which is this. So GitHub Copilot is the same basically as ChatGPT. And finally, CodeRabbit, removing those lines, request validated, and those rules are inside of form request like this. But in addition to that, it also suggests the method of messages to override the error messages, which is pretty convenient, kind of a boilerplate for more messages to be overwritten by developers. Cool. So all in all, for general validation rules like these ones, the question is just to leave them in the controller or move to form request class. But even if you leave them within the controller, both AI assistants that did this way suggested to move it to separate controller method to clean up the main store method. But again, in my opinion, if you don't use form requests and you use controllers as a private method, you're kind of not using the framework features that were created specifically for that purpose, which is form request class. So if you're just working within the same controller, you're doing it kind of in a PHP way, object-oriented programming instead of Laravel way. But again, as usual, it's personal preference. It still works. Now let's get to the second part of that validation, which is validating the data from the database with additional query of the office. The first version by one of my teammates is, as you can see, validation rule, custom validation rule. And if you want to see that rule inside, it has office ID as a parameter. In our case, it's value. It probably should have been integer. But yeah, this is basically the same thing from the controller, just moved into a separate validation rule, which is passed in the same form request here. The downside of this approach, in my opinion, I don't want to criticize anyone, I'm just kind of reviewing the code, trying to comment on pros and cons, is that we're querying office 3 times. So first exists offices that already goes to the query to the database, Then in here, inside of the validation rule, we're doing find or fail again. And by the way, find or fail, I'm not sure how it would react in case of fail inside of the validation rule. By default, it should throw 404 page, and I'm not sure how it would handle that situation in the controller. So that's the second query. And then the third query, because we need that office data in the same controller later, we're doing that again. So 3 queries to get to the office. I'm pretty sure it can be refactored, but maybe that's not the ideal way. My suggestion, my own pull request, is to get the office data from request validated. Then my suggestion, maybe not necessarily the most correct one, but let's see. So I'm moving that validation part outside of controller into a service. We'll get to services a bit later, but basically I'm using office service for both getting the data for the office, validating the main thing, and then actually saving the data. So that get office data for reservation is where I get that office data and suggest to validate it here. Because actually there's the third part of validation inside of saving the data. If we take a look at the original controller inside of cache lock, we have this. And it's a questionable thing. I didn't actually test it that deeply. Maybe there's some logic that it should be inside of that cache sentence, but in my opinion it's also validation, so it could be outside here, and if it's outside it could be grouped together. And in my version, this is a service method to get office data. It validates the data, and then if it doesn't throw any exceptions, it returns the office to the controller where it's used later. And then the third option by another teammate, what do we have here? Service set office. Pretty similar actually. Again, service class for everything related to office data, then a separate function to set the office, kind of a setter, kind of maybe a constructor you can call that. And here we have find or fail. And then later in the controller we call also check if office is available. So separate validation for the same office which is actually already set. And then again we throw validation or not. In this case, it's grouped 3 validation, and in case that validation passes, it just returns void. So it's basically the method of either throw an exception or doing nothing, kind of like a middleware. Now, what do AI assistants think about it? The version of ChatGPT, and again, we don't have form request class, but we have validate office controller method. Let's see what's inside. So we have validate office, find or fail here, and those if statements are inside of that protected function, which also returns office model object or throws an exception. And the third part of that validation, which is inside of the cache in the original, we have create reservation method in the same controller, and here we have check reservation ability or availability, sorry. So availability is another protected method that may throw validation exception. So ChatGPT left that part inside of that cache log statement. This is in general a good practice to separate such logic in separate methods in the same controller or elsewhere. That's debatable, but basically hiding the implementation which may be changed in the future, and the controller method, the main method, doesn't know how that is accomplished. It just knows the purpose that we need to validate the reservation dates. Next, we have Claude AI, and it removes all those if statements, including that cache lock and everything, in favor of reservation service, create reservation method. Let's see what's inside. In the service, reservation service, it's not office service, it's service for reservation. Inside, we have that find or fail, and inside we have validate reservation, which is the method of that service, passing the office model as a parameter and user ID from the parameter which comes from the session initially. And that validate reservation of that method contains those 2 if statements you already saw a few times. What about that third validation? We have process reservation method, again in the service, which has that validation exception inside of it. But personally, I would move it higher, at least before this one, because if we do have validation exception, I would personally prefer to throw it as early as possible in the life cycle, to not waste time and resources to calculate something that doesn't even matter because we would have validation exception anyway. So for example, if this fails, this would be calculated anyway, so additional usage of processing power. Small, but maybe relevant for bigger projects. Next, we have GitHub Copilot, and we have Office Find or Fail in the controller, and then we have check Office. Method of the controller itself, which has those two if statements. And then for creating reservation, that third validation is inside of create reservation in the same controller again, which actually didn't even change anything about that validation. It's inside of the controller. It's not even in that div on GitHub at all. Okay, another version. And finally, CodeRabbit. CodeRabbit gets the data from request validated, and then instead of those if statements, at the bottom we have this validate office, so controller method, private function here with those two if statements, and that's it. Interesting part, it creates a separate exception class, own office reservation exception. So if we take a look inside that, this is kind of a boilerplate to maybe override it with your own exception message or other behavior for that specific exception. In my opinion, it's a bit overkill for that specific case, but in some cases, those custom exceptions are useful. And that third validation sentence, according to CodeRabbit, is inside of the service class, reservation service. Inside of cache lock, we have this just moved from the controller, basically in the same place. The next part of the original controller is calculating the price. So basically this part, except for that validation, we already covered. So before actually saving the data of reservation, we have price, which should be calculated in a few lines. And by the way, we won't discuss the cache lock thing because it's the same logic by all participants, so no participant refactored that part. Is just stayed as it is, just inside of controller or inside of the service. So we get to price calculation. The first version is to move from controller to action class, create reservation action. Action classes became more popular in Laravel in recent years. So if you want to move the logic from controller to elsewhere, basically you have two options, actions or service, the most popular options I mean. And you create action if you want to perform one specific, action, and you create service mostly if you want to have multiple methods around the same, for example, office or reservation object or something like that, basically class with multiple methods. This is my own interpretation. So in this case, create reservation action, passing the validated data and the office inside, and what do we see here? We have execute and we have cache lock, making the calculations inside of that as in the original controller, so it's just moving off the same lines of code inside of the action class without any more refactoring. The next version, my version, and you partially already saw that I went for service class and not action because I have multiple methods, and the method, separate method, is get reservation price. And interesting thing here is what data are you passing to each method. So at this point we have request validated data and auth ID as a user, and this is important by the way. Separate service methods make it more testable, and I will get to that example in a minute. But basically separate method for getting the data and validating it, and then another separate method for getting the price for just the calculations from the parameters that don't depend on the database. So this is a number, a date, and a date. So inside we don't have any database operations. Get reservation price is the method inside of office service, which is this one. It works with parameters of ints and floats and strings and returns ints or floats, and it uses carbon inside. So what it allows us to do, I can interpret my own version, that's why I can talk about it a bit longer. We can write a unit test, not a feature test, like this. In this case, it's a pass test, but you could do the same in PHP unit. So you can test different prices, different combinations of price, discount, and start and end date, expecting different price to be returned. And these tests, these are unit tests, those do not touch the database. And that's why it's a unit test and not a feature test. So ideally, in especially bigger applications, you would divide the application into smaller testable methods whenever possible. So to test the reservation price logic, you would not have to call the controller, the API endpoint, or the full application. Just call the method from the service, which is separated, isolated for a unit test. That's why it's called unit test and not a feature. We're testing a specific unit, which is a method inside of the service. That's why I separated that into separate method. Then another option, after checking if the office is available, we have, instead of that controller reservation create, we have service, the same office service with method store reservation. And inside of that store reservation, we see that we have calculations inside, also in the service method of reservation service. I'm not sure if I would do the same inline, so this calculate reservation price is called inside of that Eloquent statement and not as a separate variable. But also, as you can see, a method that doesn't call the database, it just works with strings and floats, and also it has another function, so split even more reservation length in days, so this one. So that could be also tested separately with a unit test if you prefer. It's also about separation of concerns and make methods smaller in general, so each one is responsible for this logic, for its own logic. Now let's see what AI assistants suggested for calculating of the price. So create reservation by ChatGPT is a method inside of the same controller, and if we scroll down, we have the same cache lock and a separate method of calculate reservation price. Office Eloquent model as a parameter, and inside down below we have calculate reservation price method with that logic inside, also rounding price to 2 numbers after the dot and returning the price to be used later in the saving of reservation. Claude AI version, we already saw it partially. I'm kind of repeating the same pieces of code but focusing on different parts. So we have reservation service and everything is inside. So we have create reservation method, which inside we have cache lock and process reservation. Inside of that process reservation, we have calculation for number of days as a separate method inside of that service. And then calculate price works with the result of that number of days from above. And both our methods calculate number of days here and calculate price here inside of the same service. Interestingly, both examples work with model, Eloquent model object as a parameter, but I would prefer to pass price per day and monthly discount as parameters, so that method would not be depending on Eloquent at all. Next, GitHub Copilot. We have create reservation inside of the controller, and we don't have any diff about any changes in the calculations, which means it's just staying in the same controller, just in different method. Not much more to show here. And CodeRabbit, we have validated data and separate variable for user from the session, and we also have reservation service create reservation with inside we have those calculations like this. So no separate method here, but there is a separate method for calculating the price. So we have this calculate price, and down below we have this calculation. So now we finally get to the meat, to the main thing of what that controller does, is saving the reservation, creating things in Eloquent in the database. And you partially already saw how it's done by different assistants and our own team, but what I want to emphasize here is where to move that logic from controller to where. So one of the teammates chose action, 2 of us chose services, then in AI assistants, 2 assistants chose services as well, and then 2 of them chose not to move it anywhere and leave it in the same controller as protected or private methods. So just a quick rundown: action class with return reservation inside of the action class method execute. This is one of the teammates. Then the second version, my own version, and this is where I will stop a bit longer. I didn't take that part into Office service, and let me tell you why. I have to kind of explain my train of thoughts here. So over the years, after shooting many videos and seeing a lot of comments from you guys from the community on YouTube, on Twitter, and elsewhere, I saw one line of thought which says that not every method needs to be shortened and separated. So for example, when reading that controller in the future, imagine future developer or ourselves, we care about what that method does, stores the reservation. We care about the validation, but we don't care how it is done, so that is separated. We care about the calculations, but we don't care how it is done again. And we care about saving the data and that main meat of the method. We do care about how it's done because we're looking at, well, the main method of storing the reservation. So this part, in my opinion, should be visible right away sometimes. It depends. If you prefer to separate that, it's fine. But I personally interpreted that separation of concerns, or kind of each method is responsible for its own logic. So this is the logic of that store method. So that's why in some cases, including this case, I don't move that elsewhere to the service, but we can of course discuss everything in the comments. Then the next option by my colleague Modestas is store reservation from service, which is exactly returned immediately from reservation resource, so we don't even have a separate variable here. We have reservation service, which returns reservation object right away without a separate temporary variable. AI assistants create reservation method in the same controller by ChatGPT, which contains the same reservation create, so there's no even diff here. Claude AI create reservation in the service in this case, and we have the same cache lock with process reservation. So in this case, service contains a separate method inside to process reservation, and inside of that, at the end, we have Eloquent statement. By the way, I haven't emphasized how that service is created in Claude AI. So it is in constructor. Using PHP 8 syntax, it's called constructor property promotion from what I remember. So we don't have to create that object manually. And then we need to have reservation service, which we can use as this reservation service wherever we need in that controller. In this case, it's just one call of that service, but especially if you want to use service multiple times in the same controller, then you should put that in constructor probably. GitHub Copilot has create reservation in the same controller, again with no diff, so it doesn't really change. And CodeRabbit, again a service, create reservation, and in that service class, create reservation has Eloquent inside. It also adds additional structure on cache lock, get, try, finally. In my opinion, it may be a bit overkill, but in some cases that lock doesn't work by default. For example, something is wrong with cache driver, so if we do have the lock, we proceed, but then if we don't have the lock, there's another validation exception. And the final part, this one is identical in most cases, but this is not. So when should you send those notifications? Where? In the same controller or refactored somewhere else? Let's see the options. You already saw them probably in the previous minutes where I scrolled through the code, but let's recap and focus on those. So one of the teammates removed that into a job, which should be dispatched in a queue. So you can set the queuable notifications directly or a separate job to send many notifications. So inside of that job, we pass the user and the reservation and move that here. One of the options. Then in my version, I didn't move them anywhere because in my opinion, 2 lines of code which are readable and clear may still belong in the controller. I don't see anything wrong with that. And another colleague, Modestas, moved it elsewhere. So this is one of the cases where all 3 of us made totally different decisions. So Nereus took jobs, I left it in the controller, and Modestas moved it to observer of Eloquent. So in the model reservation, we have observed by, which is a pretty new syntax in Laravel. I think it was Laravel 10 point something, the way to register the observer. And then in the observer, we have those notifications. Another different way of doing that would be events and listeners, which may be a bit better than observer in my opinion, because controller would contain the code that such event happens, and there are some listeners in the background. In the case of observer, controller doesn't say anything about notifications being fired, so it may surprise some developers who read only that controller code and don't see any notifications mentioned here. What about AI assistants? ChatGPT special method notify users in the same controller. So those 2 lines are in protected method of the same controller. Claude AI in the controller, there's no notification, so it is in the service. As a method, send notifications inside of the service class, like this, private method in the service. GitHub Copilot, controller method, send notifications, and down below we see those 2 lines of code. Basically, ChatGPT and GitHub Copilot are very similar in their answers because maybe, or in fact not maybe, it's probably GitHub Copilot uses OpenAI API under the hood. And then CodeRabbit kind of improvised even more, same notification with dispatch. So dispatch function to the same notification. I'm not sure why, to be honest. Maybe comment below if you know the logic here. What would be the practical real difference instead of launching them right away? So in my opinion, either you launch it here or put into a queue or a job and then dispatch it. In this case, in my opinion, those 2 are identical, but I may be wrong here. And so yeah, that's it, the last line of the controller method. So see how much we can talk about different versions of the refactoring of the same one method in one controller of Laravel. For many years, I've been noticing that Laravel is freedom, so to speak, so it allows you to structure the code in many ways you prefer. Part of that comes with Laravel functionality, like you should probably use form requests because that's what it's meant for. But in other cases, it's mostly about object-oriented programming, PHP, and structuring the classes to be separate, testable, maintainable, and clear to read for others in the future or yourself in the future. Now, what do you think about this, like battle humans versus AI in this case? In my opinion, AI assistants have done a pretty impressive job. It's basically on the same level of refactoring, almost the same level as we humans did, and sometimes suggesting even more stuff that we didn't think about. It's an open question whether that's over-engineering, but in some cases, it's totally useful. So that specific use case of using AI as assistants to review code, to suggest refactorings, to maybe look for vulnerabilities, that is a perfectly valid use case, and I'm totally sure we'll see more of those tools and better tools in the near future. It doesn't mean it will take away our jobs as developers. The original code is still our own, and the logic of the project is done by a developer, and the prompt to AI is done by a developer. So that's why at this point we call it an assistant, but we'll see in the long-term future. And if we try to compare all those 4 AI assistants with each other, I was mostly impressed with 2 of them, Claude and CodeRabbit. ChatGPT and Copilot didn't go the extra mile of refactoring. They basically left most of the things in the same controller, which is still okay, but that was not what I was going for. And of course, it depends on the configuration of each tool, what model is used. But in all cases, we used the default things, and also the prompt was very vague intentionally. I wanted to test how they perform without any additional instructions or additional effort on the developer side. But again, with different prompts and different models, you may have different results and different conclusions. And also AI models are evolving with fast speed, so I will probably need to retest it in a few months as well. And finally, if you want to dig deeper into how to structure Laravel projects, not only from the controller side, I have a course, very popular course, How to Structure Laravel Projects, which is now currently discounted with the Black Friday. So this is the table of contents also about first refactoring the controller, but here we also talk about queue jobs, base controllers and helpers, and also a few more global topics. This course is a part of Laravel Daily Premium membership, and currently this week until December 2nd, in fact, with the coupon code Friday24, you get 40% off either lifetime membership or the first year of the yearly membership. And also I'm planning to talk about AI quite a lot in 2025. I see the perspective and angles here to talk about, so expect that also in Laravel Daily courses. That's another incentive to subscribe to the membership. That's it for this time, and see you guys in other videos.